Most people think Hitler lost the war in the snow outside Moscow in December of 1941. He didn't. He lost it 3 months earlier in August, in a command tent in Ukraine, with a decision that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with where he pointed his tanks. There's a phrase in a general's diary from that summer, 4 words written in frustration, by a man who watched it happen and could do nothing about it. I'll come back to that phrase. It's the whole story if you know how to read it. I'm Arthur Finch. By the 3rd week of August 1941, the German army was 2 months into Operation Barbarossa and standing closer to total victory than it would ever stand again. Army Group Center, the strongest of the 3 German army groups, had punched through the Soviet frontier, encircled and destroyed entire armies at Minsk and Smolensk, and now sat roughly 350 kilometers from Moscow. Ahead of them, by most German estimates, lay an exhausted Red Army and an open road. Behind them, in Berlin and at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, a different argument was already underway, one that would decide far more than a single campaign. This is where the story actually begins, not with tanks, with a disagreement about what the war was for. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, believed the road to victory ran through Moscow. Not for sentimental reasons. Halder didn't think capturing a capital city carried some magical weight. He believed it because Moscow was the hub of the Soviet rail and road network, the seat of government and command, and because intelligence suggested the bulk of the remaining Red Army was concentrating there to defend it. Destroy that force, Halder argued, and the Soviet state's capacity to keep fighting collapses with it. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, agreed completely. So did von Brauchitsch, the army's commander-in-chief. The professional soldiers running the campaign on paper were, for once, nearly unanimous. Hitler disagreed. And Hitler, as the generals were about to be reminded in the bluntest possible terms, was not interested in their unanimity. Wait, before I go further, you need to understand what Hitler was actually looking at, because this wasn't simple stubbornness. To the south, in Ukraine, a massive Soviet force, eventually estimated at over 600,000 men, the bulk of the Soviet southwestern front, sat exposed in a salient around Kiev. To the north, Army Group North was grinding toward Leningrad and needed help. Hitler looked at a map crowded with vulnerable Soviet formations and economic prizes, Ukraine's wheat, the Donbass coalfields, the industrial centers along the way, and saw an opportunity his generals were proposing to simply drive past. In his mind, Moscow was a symbol, Ukraine was substance. He believed that if Germany broke the Soviet Union's economic base and annihilated its armies in detail, the symbolic capital would fall on its own, later at a lower cost. It's a coherent argument. Historians still argue about whether it was the right one. I'll give you my own view by the end of this. But before I tell you how the decision was made, I want you to actually weigh it yourself, the way Hitler weighed it. Because that's the only fair way to judge a strategic choice. Not by what we know happened after, but by what a reasonable person could have believed at the time. Put yourself in his position for 30 seconds. You command roughly 3.5 million men, spread across a front 1,000 kilometers wide. To your north, an Allied army group needs reinforcement to take a major city. To your south, 600,000 enemy soldiers sit in a salient, badly positioned, ripe for destruction, guarding territory that produces a large share of the enemy's grain and coal. Ahead of you, in the center, lies the enemy capital, defended, according to your own intelligence, by the single largest concentration of enemy reserves anywhere on the map. Do you drive at the most heavily defended point on the entire front, betting that one city's fall ends the war? Or do you take the exposed army and the resources first and let the capital come to you once the enemy can no longer feed or arm itself? Framed that way, it isn't an irrational question. It's the wrong answer to a real question. And the difference between those two things is most of what makes this story worth telling. Here's how it actually happened. because the way this decision was made tells you almost as much as the decision itself. On August 21st, 1941, Hitler issued a directive that overruled his own general staff outright. Halder recorded it in his diary in language stripped of any diplomatic softening. He called the new plan utopian and unacceptable, and went further, writing that the Army High Command could no longer take responsibility for what was now happening to the campaign. Hitler's adjutant, Gerhard Engel, wrote in his own diary that day that it was, in his words, a black day for the army. Halder was furious enough to offer his resignation. Von Brauchitsch, his superior, talked him out of it. Here's the part that matters. The next day, Halder summoned the senior commanders of Army Group Center to deliver the news in person. Von Bock was there. So was General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German tank warfare and commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, the very tanks now being ordered south. Halder read out Hitler's decision. Army Group Center would halt its advance on Moscow. Guderian's panzers, along with Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group, would be redirected to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces around Kiev. Von Bock asked the obvious question, "What can we do against this decision?" Halder's answer, as later recorded by men who were in the room, was 4 words long. Nothing. It's immutable. Guderian didn't accept that. He flew to Hitler's headquarters that same week and argued the case for Moscow directly, face to face, for hours. He laid out the logistics, the timetable, the danger of running out of campaigning season before winter. Hitler heard him out completely and then overruled him anyway, this time with the entire assembled high command present to witness it. Guderian later wrote that this was the moment he understood the argument was truly over, not lost on the merits, simply over, because one man's authority in the German state had become absolute, and military judgment no longer had the standing to challenge it. Stop for a second and sit with that. The 2 most capable tank commanders in the German army, the chief of the general staff, and the commander of the strongest army group in the field. All of them telling the supreme commander the same thing. All of them overruled by a man whose military experience consisted of 4 years as a corporal in the trenches of the First World War. This is not hindsight talking. The disagreement was total, and it was happening in real time, recorded the same week by the men living through it. So the panzers turned south. What followed was, by any military measure, a spectacular victory, which is exactly what makes this story so difficult and so worth telling carefully. Guderian's and Hoth's tanks, combined with von Rundstedt's Army Group South pushing up from the other direction, closed a pincer around the Soviet southwestern front near Kiev by mid-September. The encirclement that resulted, the Battle of Kiev, produced the largest single capture of prisoners in the history of warfare. German figures claimed over 660,000 Soviet soldiers taken. 4 Soviet armies were destroyed outright. The Southwestern Front's commander, General Mikhail Kirponos, was killed trying to break out of the pocket. By any tactical standard, the German army had just won one of the most lopsided battles ever fought. You'd assume that settles the argument in Hitler's favor. You'd be wrong. And this is the part of the story most people skip past, because a victory this large is hard to question. But before I get to why, I want to tell you about one man inside that pocket. Because the strategic argument I've been laying out can start to feel abstract, distances on a map, dates in a directive, and it shouldn't. It caused something specific. General Mikhail Kirponos commanded the Soviet Southwestern Front, the force now being crushed inside the German encirclement. By the second week of September, he could see what was happening as clearly as anyone. He requested permission to withdraw his armies east across the Dnieper River to abandon the pocket before it closed completely. Stalin refused. Kiev was to be held. It was not until September 19th, by which point German units had already linked up east of the city and the trap had effectively shut, that Moscow finally authorized a withdrawal. By then, there was nowhere left to withdraw to. Kirponos ordered what breakout he could organize on September 17th. It was already too late to be anything but desperate. Soviet infantry, what remained of the tanks, even cavalry, tried to punch through the German ring near a patch of forest called Shumakovo High, close to the village of Shandrivka. The Germans were dug in and waiting, with anti-tank guns and aircraft covering every approach. On September 20th, 1941, Kiponos was killed by shrapnel during that attempt, alongside his chief of staff, General Vasily Tupakov, and Mikhailo Burmaschenko, the political commissar of the front. Soviet sources place the number of men who actually escaped the pocket somewhere between 15 and 35,000, out of a force that had numbered well over 500,000. By the time the last organized resistance inside the pocket surrendered on September 26th, 4 entire Soviet field armies had effectively ceased to exist. The Southwestern Front would have to be rebuilt almost from nothing. This is the part that matters. Ask yourself what that victory actually cost the Germans, not in lives, though it cost plenty of those on both sides, but in something far less visible and far more decisive. Time. I'll come back to exactly how much time. Keep that in mind, it matters more than it sounds like right now. While Guderian's tanks were grinding toward Kiev, the calendar kept moving. And the calendar was the one enemy German strategy had never properly accounted for. Army Group Center's panzers were now hundreds of kilometers from where they'd been in August, engaged in a different battle on a different axis, drawing down fuel and wearing out engines and tracks that had already covered enormous distances since June. When the Kiev pocket finally collapsed in the 3rd week of September, those panzer groups had to be pulled back, refueled, repaired where possible, and redirected once more, this time back north, back toward Moscow, for an offensive that German planners now called Operation Typhoon. Typhoon began on September 30th and October 2nd, 1941. Von Bock's Army Group Center attacking with roughly 1 million men, around 1,700 tanks, and nearly 20,000 artillery pieces. Compare that date to what Army Group Center could have attempted in late August, with its tank formations intact, fuel supplies less depleted, and roughly 5 extra weeks of dry autumn campaigning weather still ahead of it before the rains came and turned Russian roads into the kind of mud that swallows trucks whole. Here I want you to imagine you're standing where the Soviet High Command was standing in early October, because the next part of the story only makes sense from that side of the line. Typhoon opened with catastrophic speed. German panzers encircled the bulk of 3 Soviet fronts at Vyazma and Bryansk within the first 2 weeks, taking by German figures, well over 600,000 more prisoners and more than 1,200 tanks. General Andrei Yeremenko's Bryansk front headquarters was overrun so quickly that Stalin briefly believed the entire command structure had simply ceased to exist. One Soviet general, Konstantin Rokossovsky, reached Vyazma on October 6th, hoping to organize a defense, and found nothing there but the local police. His own troops had already been swallowed by the pocket forming around them. The road to Moscow, genuinely, now lay open. Some accounts have the Soviet capital's evacuation planning underway within days. Lenin's embalmed body removed from the city for safekeeping. Rumors spreading that German troops had already entered the suburbs. Stop for a second. This is the moment everyone who studies 1941 returns to, because it's the closest the German army would ever come to winning outright. And it's also where the cost of August finally comes due. General Georgy Zhukov was pulled out of besieged Leningrad and rushed to Moscow, arriving on October 7th to take command of whatever could still be organized in front of the capital. What bought him the time to do that, and this is the detail historians keep returning to, was the same encircled, doomed Soviet force at Vyazma and Bryansk that the Germans had just shattered. Those trapped armies kept fighting inside their own collapsing pocket for days after the encirclement closed, tying down German divisions that would otherwise have driven straight on toward Moscow. It's a brutal kind of arithmetic. Men who had already lost the battle they were fighting still managing, through sheer refusal to simply surrender, to buy their own capital several more days to prepare. And then the weather did what no Soviet division alone could do that month. By the end of October, the autumn rains turned the unpaved roads of central Russia into the Rasputitsa, the mud season, and ground the German advance to a near standstill for more than 2 weeks. German trucks sank to their axles. Tanks burned fuel just to stay in place. The offensive that had looked unstoppable in the second week of October was, by the third week, barely moving at all. This is the part that matters, so let me say it plainly. When Typhoon finally found firmer ground with the first hard frosts in mid-November, it resumed with real force. The Wehrmacht's forward reconnaissance units came by the start of December within sight of Moscow's outer suburbs. Some accounts placed German patrols close enough to glimpse the spires of the Kremlin through field glasses. And then the cold came. Not gradually, brutally, and far earlier and harder than German planners had prepared for, since this was a campaign that had been promised as finished before autumn. German units that had marched and fought continuously since June in summer uniforms with vehicles and lubricants never designed for temperatures that fell to -30 and below simply stopped functioning. Tank engines froze solid overnight. Frostbite casualties in some divisions outnumbered combat wounds. On December 5, 1941, the German offensive against Moscow was suspended. The next day, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive with fresh Siberian divisions Stalin had gambled on bringing west because intelligence, correctly as it turned out, told him Japan would not attack from the east. German forces were pushed back from the gates of the city they had come within sight of taking. This is the line I promised you at the beginning. Halder, writing in his diary that same August, watching Hitler overrule every professional soldier around him, used 4 words to describe what he thought the consequence of all this would be. He wrote that the demands now being placed on the army had become, in his words, no longer in proportion. 4 words, written by the one man in the room with the authority and the knowledge to see the collision coming between ambition and arithmetic, and no power left to stop it. He was right. Whether he was right that Moscow itself would have fallen if Army Group Center had pressed on in late August instead of turning south, is something historians still debate seriously, and I won't pretend the question is settled. Some have argued the Red Army's reserves around Moscow in August were still strong enough that an early German drive might simply have stalled there too, trading one kind of failure for another. But what almost no serious historian disputes is this: the 5 to 6 weeks consumed by the diversion to Kiev were precisely the 5 to 6 weeks that would have let Army Group Center reach Moscow's outskirts before the hardest weather, rather than after it had already begun grinding the army down. Kiev was won. The clock that mattered more than Kiev was not something German tanks, however many of them, could win back. Think about that the next time someone tells you a battle's outcome is the only thing that matters. The Wehrmacht achieved at Kiev one of the most complete tactical victories in the history of organized warfare. And historians still point to that same victory as the likely turning point that cost Germany its best chance at winning the war in the East. Before it became a war of attrition Germany could not win. Tactics and strategy are not the same instrument, and the men in that room in August of 1941 were arguing about which one mattered more, with the entire weight of the Eastern Front balanced on the answer. I think about Halder sometimes, not as a hero, because his record afterward, helping shape a post-war narrative that protected the German army's reputation more than the truth deserved, complicates any simple admiration. But in that single week in August, he was the man in the room who did the arithmetic correctly, and was overruled by someone who didn't need to be right, only obeyed. That's not unique to 1941, or to Germany, or to war. Most of us at some point watch a decision get made that we know, not suspect, know is going to cost more than anyone in the room is willing to admit. The history of the Eastern Front in 1941 is, underneath everything else, a study in what happens when the people who can see the cost most clearly have the least power to stop the spending. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.